So I don't know what's harder on a Sunday like this, to sit and listen with the smell of bacon in the air, or to preach with the smell of bacon in the air. Yes, it's bacon. So today this is the final Sunday. It's kind of hard to believe this, but we've had hints of spring, right? Hopefully we've had that last snowstorm, knock on wood. But this is the last Sunday before Lent begins. We will, as Pastor Kathy mentions, our Ash Wednesday schedule will have an in-person service at 12:05, and that's designed for those who are on their lunch break. It will be short, within 45 minutes or so, but then we're going to be available right out here on Jefferson Street under the overhang between 5 and 6:30 to greet you and pray with you and impose the ashes, and that's more one-on-one. We did that last year with obviously with COVID, and people really enjoyed that. It seemed more personal. So if you're doing that, or if you're coming, that's especially an opportunity for those who can only worship online. If you're coming, line up at the alleyway that'd be the west side of the church. So we've been exploring Google questions, and our final Google question that we're exploring is this: what is a Christian? Who goes first? Well, how would you define that? There was a time not too long ago when, if you were not Jewish or Hindu or Buddhist, by default you were a Christian. There weren't a whole lot of choices, but we find ourselves in a time in today's world, and I actually think this is a good development, where the word Christian means something specific, because there are other choices. The fastest growing group in North America of religions is actually nuns, as in none of the above. And I'm not saying that to be funny, that's just a fact. I think the last statistic I saw is 23% of people in North America put themselves in that category. That's significant. Or the fastest growing religion are those who label themselves as spiritual but not religious. And the reason I think this is good is because it gives room for people to explore and ask that question: why? Why do I fall in that category of a nun? Why do I fall in that category of spiritual, not religious? Why do I fall in that category of being a Christian? So what does it mean to really be a Christian in today's world? We could ask the same question about scouting. What does it mean in today's world to be a scout? And so I'm going to invite one of our newer Eagle Scouts, Carter. Carter, come on up. If you would grab that mic right there. I'm going to ask Carter. I asked Carter, did you volunteer or were you voluntold?
A little bit of both, I think.
A little bit of both.
A little bit of both.
A little bit of both. So, Carter, introduce yourself to the church.
My name is Carter Stoner. I am 18 years old from Morgan Township. They're off of 49. I'm from Troop 906, and I recently earned my Eagle.
All right. Good. Congratulations. So if we were to meet on the elevator and I saw your uniform, and I would ask you, well, what is a scout? A scout is, what would you say?
Well, the first thing people think of as scout is trustworthy, loyal, helpful, friendly, all the scout law right there. But
what is all that?
Well, I think it's more of a guideline, and I think that being a scout is more being careful and open-minded to other people, and having an open hand to other people. I think that's really what a scout is.
Is it challenging to do all these things that are up on the screen, to be everyday, courteous, kind, obedient, cheerful, thrifty, brave, clean, and reverent?
It's challenging to change your mindset, but once the mindset is changed, it becomes a part of you. And that's where it is.
Okay. You're a very smart young man. Thank you. Okay, so I didn't pick anybody out. Do I have a volunteer? What to explain to Carter what a Christian is? That's okay. That's okay. Because in the world, according to surveys, for not pulling any punches here, I've said this before, for the last 20 years, in public surveys, when people are asked to, well, what is a Christian? The first two words out of their mouth is, well, a Christian is judgmental and hypocritical. That's been the most popular response. But if we look inside ourselves, according to Galatians 5, much as a scout is defined as what they do, so is a Christian. So according to Galatians 5, a Christian is loving and joyful and peace-filled and patient and kind and generous, faith-filled, gentle, and disciplined. Is that hard? Is that a challenge? I mean, that's a challenge. I loved your answer, Carter, that it becomes a mindset. It becomes part of who we are. Honestly, if you got up in the morning and just read this and focused on this, I think everything else falls into place. But there's more to it, right? If we're listening to Jesus this morning, if what Ruth shared, it's challenging. A dictionary definition of a Christian would read that a Christian is one who professes Jesus as Christ, as Messiah. And that's a good starting point. And like many dictionary definitions, it falls short of the reality of a working definition of what a Christian is. And interestingly, in the Bible, we find that word Christian appears very few times. It actually only appears in the entire New Testament, and so in the entire Bible, it only appears 3 times. The first time occurs in Acts 11. It was in Antioch that the disciples were first called Christians. They were called Christians. That word got attached to them because the people realized what they were doing, what they were saying, was literally a reflection. Their behavior, actions, and speech reminded them of Jesus himself. Now think about that. In that time and place, the people who lived in Antioch, they would have remembered, oh yeah, I remember Jesus coming through here. Man, he was awesome. And that's what the people who follow him remind me of. It literally, that word Christian literally means belonging to the party of Christ, or a follower of Christ. And we have just 2 other mentions in Acts 26. Agrippa said to Paul, "Are you so quickly persuading me to become a Christian?" Or 1 Peter wrote, "Yet if any of you suffer as a Christian, do not consider it a disgrace, but glorify God because you bear this name." You know, in context here, much like in the early days of Methodism, to be called a Methodist was not a compliment. It was not a term of endearment. In some places, it was a term of contempt. Last fall, we heard a series of sermons. You remember the essentials of Christianity? A Christian life is defined by a cycle of these 5 elements. Remember these? Worship and learning and serving and giving and sharing. That sharing is really telling others. And this was the purpose of the early church. This is how the early church was defined. And really, I think because of COVID, we're getting back to our roots as a church. What does it really mean to be the church? And what we find is in the concluding comments that Jesus made, as Jesus is drawing the greatest sermon that was ever preached. And this was out in the open air. There was no sound system. There was no internet. There was no online community. There was no bacon frying while he was preaching. I mean, people could hear him. And he had some pretty important things to say about what it means to be a Christian, and some of it is challenging. As Jesus concludes his sermon, he talks about the way. And he says, so the working definition of a Christian is to be a believer and follower of Jesus Christ. And that believer unifies him or herself with other Christians for the purpose of worship, learning, serving, and giving. I apologize, I got ahead of myself. See, I told you it's distracting. So, thank you for your grace. But here's what Jesus had to say about the challenge of living this. He said in his sermon, "For the gate is narrow and the road is hard that leads to life, and there are few who find it." I mean, if we're honest with ourselves and with Jesus, we find Jesus doesn't pull any punches here. He just says what needs to be said. Even though it's available to anyone and everyone, this Christian walk, it's not easy. Being a Christian is challenging, and it's supposed to be. And there are those who will be Christians in name only. You know, I was not kidding when I said in the opening video, I was a Boy Scout in the loosest sense of the word. In name only. But Jesus warns us. He said, "Beware of false prophets who come to you in sheep's clothing, but inwardly are ravenous wolves. You will know them." How? By their fruits. In the same way, every good tree bears good fruit. What is that fruit? Well, people know us, know Christians by what? Our love, our joy, our peace, our patience, our kindness, our generosity, faithfulness, gentleness, self-control. So let me pause here. And you know, we've been bragging on the scouts, to the scouts. I want to brag on these people. We have, for the first time in a while, we had, I guess what we would consider this past week a full-blown funeral and funeral dinner. We haven't done that in a while for Betty Jankowski. And there were a lot of people here. The fellowship hall was full of tables for the meal. We had the visitation here and the funeral, and the place was abuzz. And it's not really about the busyness, but it was about the comments that was coming back from the family. If you don't know, Betty had 8 kids. And I think they all had 8 kids. I'm not sure, but there were, I lost count. I just assumed everybody was family. But remember, she was 102, almost 102, and so there were a lot of people here. And you know, the family from out of town, here's what one of her sons came up to me and said, he said, now I understand why this church was so important to Mom. He said, if I lived here, this is where I'd want to go to church. He said, this place, I'm quoting here, this place is awesome. So give yourself a hand. You did a great job. This is what a disciple does. This is what a Christian does. Worships, learns, serves, and gives. Not so, it's nice to be noticed, but it's not to glorify ourselves. But we heard it this morning, so that God can be glorified. We want God to get the credit. And Jesus offers this warning. He's wrapping things up in his sermon. So he's getting to the meat of it. He says, not everyone who says to me, Lord, Lord, will enter the kingdom of heaven, but only the one who does the will of my Father in heaven. A Christian doesn't follow Jesus for the benefits, but for the joy of doing the will of their Father in heaven. Carey Nieuwhof writes this. I've quoted him before, but I love what he writes here. He says, the world does not need a reflection of itself. The world needs an alternative to itself. And this is our opportunity. This is what the church and Christianity has always offered that's attractive. It's an alternative. And finally, Jesus concludes by defining his followers as what? Hearers and doers. Everyone who hears these words of mine and acts on them will be like a wise man who built his house on a rock. The rain fell, the floods came, the winds blew and beat on that house, but it did not fall because it was founded on rock. Being a Christian in today's world, yes, is to provide an alternative, is to be a little bit different. It's to engage and be engaged, and to engage others. And so a Christian lives in this cycle of worship and learning and serving and giving and telling. A disciple, a Christian, hears and does, because that's what we're here for. It's more than just showing up. I can show up, I can join the Y and show up and have a cup of coffee and drink my coffee and read my newspaper. I can do that several times a week, but when I step on the scale 6 months later and I see that I've gained 10 pounds, guess whose fault it is not? I'm not going to say, well, I'm going to quit the Y. I'm just not being fed. You have to engage in it. You have to be engaged in it. So a Christian is a believer and follower of Jesus who unifies him or herself with other Christians for what? A purpose of worship and learning and serving and giving and telling. Being a follower, being a Christian, being a disciple, it is a challenge. And this week, I think we've seen the power of what it means to be a Christian in our world by observing what's going on in the Ukraine. We don't see this on the news. We're going to have to find this through alternative sources. There was a video circulated online of Christians worshiping in a subway. They were singing. This was 2 days before the attack occurred. They were singing a song called "Let My Prayers Flow," which was written as a prayer for their country, praying for salvation and mercy and forgiveness and protection. See, this is the power of the church. This is the power of being a Christian. We are joined with them through our hearts. We are joined and we are called to pray for one another and pray for the people in the Ukraine, for peace and stability during a very difficult and dark time. You know, my father was in World War II. My my older brother was in Vietnam. And if they were here, they would tell you that saying is true. There really are no atheists in foxholes. Perhaps it's not a coincidence. I wonder. I don't think anything is a coincidence. Perhaps it's not a coincidence that this is taking place during a time where we are preparing for the season of Lent. The season of Lent, it's that 40-day season leading up to Easter, and it begins on Wednesday. It begins within the hopelessness of our own sin, of the meaningless, literally the meaninglessness you know what I'm saying, of life. Here's what we say when we impose the ashes. From ashes you were created, and to ashes you will return. This isn't my line, but somebody said, Ash Wednesday is the most depressing day of the year. And it's not really a recipe for attractive Christianity, but I'll tell you what, it's real. It is an alternative. Because the empty tomb of Easter does not happen without the reality of our sin, the hopelessness of our condition, that we cannot truly save ourselves. The empty tomb is just as much of a sign of God's triumph and goodness as the cross is. So as we prepare our hearts and minds for Lent, I guess the question is, where do you fall in this? How do you define yourself? Are you a Christian? Are you a nun? Are you a spiritual but not religious? Are you just sitting on the sidelines? Because really what we find in today's world is it's really not about being Methodist or Baptist or Lutheran or Catholic. And it's really not about being an American or Greek or Chinese or Ukrainian, and it's not about being religious. So as we make our way into this new season of Lent, I urge you to use this time for what it's for. A time to examine your own heart, to explore your own life and answer that question, what does it mean to me to be a Christian, to be a follower of Jesus? And you know what? If you classify yourself as a non, then take this time to explore your heart and answer that question. What does that really mean? Even if you're spiritual but not religious, what does that really mean? This is the time to do it. Not because it's Lent, but because at some point we all have to ask that question. And if you're curious, there are people around you who would love to introduce you to Jesus Christ. Are you ready? Wednesday's coming. And as the saying goes, yes, it's Friday, but Sunday's coming. And God is always good. And all the time.